"You're fired?" Robert's voice echoed through the gas station, causing other customers to turn and watch the scene unfold. "How dare you use company money for your charity?" Jessica, the convenience store attendant that day, still holding the fuel nozzle, tried to explain. "But, Mr. Robert, I used my own money. It was what I had saved for my bus tickets this week." "I don't care," Robert interrupted, his face flushed with anger. "You wasted company time with this nonsense. I want you out of here now." Next to him, an elderly man leaned on a cane, watching the scene with tears in his eyes. Moments earlier, he had walked into the gas station with only a few coins in his pocket, desperate to get enough gas to reach the hospital where his wife was hospitalized. Without a second thought, Jessica had used her own savings to help him. Now, under the cold light of the fluorescent lamps and the curious gazes of the customers, Jessica felt the weight of her decision. But something inside her, a force forged by years of overcoming hardship, told her she had done the right thing. It was incredible how one moment of kindness could cost so much. Yet, to truly understand why Jessica couldn't simply ignore others' suffering, you had to go back in time, to a small house in the countryside, where an 8-year-old girl learned the harshest lesson of all: that life could be cruel. Jessica's childhood was abruptly interrupted one autumn morning when her mother, Laura, lost her battle to a devastating illness. The last few months had been a whirlwind of hospitals, expensive treatments, and dwindling hope. Laura passed away, leaving only memories, medical bills, and a daughter in the care of a stepfather who was unprepared to be a father. Michael, the stepfather, worked at a local factory. A man hardened by life even before meeting Laura, he turned to alcohol to cope with the loss. Beer bottles became his constant companions, and his frustration found an outlet in little Jessica. Days in the house became an exercise in survival. Jessica learned to read the signs: the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs, the clink of empty bottles, the smell of alcohol that preceded the shouting. She developed a meticulous routine, trying to be invisible, doing everything perfectly to avoid waking Michael's rage. "You're just like your mother," he would shout, staggering around the house. "Always looking at me with those accusing eyes. Do you think I didn't do enough? That I didn't spend everything I had trying to save her?" The thin walls of the house couldn't contain the shouting, the sound of breaking objects, the muffled sobs of a child growing up too fast. The neighbors heard, but for a long time they chose silence. It was easier to pretend they didn't see the bruises on the girl's arms, or ignore her eyes, always swollen from crying. It was Martha, the lady who lived next door, who finally decided she could no longer be a silent accomplice to that suffering. She began documenting every incident, every scream that pierced through the walls, every mark that appeared on Jessica's body. The night that changed everything began like so many others. Michael came home from the bar more intoxicated than usual. The sound of glass shattering and a sharp scream of pain were the spark Martha needed. With trembling hands, she finally dialed the police. When the authorities arrived, they found Jessica curled up in a corner of the kitchen, surrounded by shards of a broken bottle. Michael, in his drunken state, could barely stand. The scene was heartbreaking. Broken plates scattered across the floor, fist marks on the walls, and the empty gaze of a child who had lost her childhood. The process was swift. With the evidence gathered by Martha and the testimony from the neighbors who had finally found the courage to speak, Jessica was removed from Michael's custody. The child protection system placed her in a local orphanage, an old brick building that, despite its austere appearance, would represent a new beginning. At the orphanage, Jessica met Mrs. Thompson, a caregiver who would become crucial to her healing. With gray hair always tied up in an untidy bun and a kind smile that reached her eyes, Mrs. Thompson had a special gift for working with traumatized children. "You're stronger than you think, dear," she would tell Jessica as she helped her adjust to the new routine. "Life may have been hard on you up until now, but that doesn't define who you are or who you can become." Little by little, Jessica began to open up. The nights of terror were replaced by moments of peace, although the nightmares still visited her occasionally. She discovered she had a natural talent for taking care of the younger children at the orphanage, comforting them when they cried for their homes or helping them with their lessons. Years passed, and at 18, it was time to leave the orphanage. Mrs. Thompson helped her find a small apartment and a job at the gas station. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a chance to build something of her own. "Remember, Jessica," Mrs. Thompson had said on the day the young woman left, "your story isn't about the bad things that happened to you. It's about how you chose to respond to them. Never lose that kindness in your heart." And now, 3 years later, there she was, being punished precisely for following that advice. As she gathered her belongings under Robert's merciless gaze, she couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. The elderly man, still standing beside her, tried to intervene, but his weak voice was barely audible above the manager's shouts. Jessica walked out of the gas station with her head held high, carrying a small box with her belongings. The night was beginning to fall, and a light drizzle started to wet the streets. She didn't know what the future held, but something inside her told her she had made the right choice. After all, her entire life had been a lesson on how kindness, even in the hardest moments, was the only thing that truly mattered. What Jessica didn't know was that this act of compassion, which seemed to have cost her everything, was about to open doors she had never imagined possible. Fate had bigger plans for her, and sometimes, it's precisely when we lose everything that we find our true path. The light drizzle that had fallen when Jessica left the station soon turned into a downpour. Soaked and carrying the box with her belongings, she walked to the nearest bus stop, where she took shelter under the metal canopy. The reflection of city lights in the puddles created a melancholic scene that mirrored her state of mind. Her savings, which were supposed to cover her transportation for the week, were now in the elderly man's car tank. Jessica didn't regret it, but the reality of her situation was starting to weigh on her. Rent was due in just a few days, and her reserves were practically non-existent. As she waited for the bus that seemed like it would never arrive, her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Jessica, wait." It was Tom, one of the convenience store attendants, running toward her with an umbrella. "What happened after I left?" Jessica asked, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Tom, a guy in his mid-20s who had always been kind to her during her shifts at the store, shook his head in disapproval. "Robert's impossible. After you left, he started yelling at everyone, saying he'd do the same to anyone who wasted the company's time with charity." Tom hesitated before continuing. "But there's more. The elderly man you helped, he was really shaken up by everything. He tried talking to Robert, but he was basically kicked out of the station." Jessica felt a tightness in her chest. "I hope he managed to get to the hospital." "He did," Tom reassured her. "But before he left this for you." He handed her a folded piece of paper, already a little damp from the rain. With trembling hands, Jessica unfolded the paper. It was a hastily written note. "Thank you for your kindness. My name is William Parker, and my wife is at the Central Hospital. Please come find me there when you can. I want to repay your kindness in some way." Jessica tucked the note into her bag, doubting that she would ever seek out Mr. Parker. Her life experience had taught her that accepting help wasn't always safe, even when it came from seemingly well-meaning people. "There's one more thing," Tom continued, lowering his voice. "You know Rachel from the Register?" She called the headquarters of the chain. Apparently, the owner, Mr. Anderson, found out about the incident and he wasn't happy with Robert's behavior. Before Jessica could respond, her bus finally arrived. She said a quick goodbye to Tom with a brief hug and boarded, watching through the foggy window as her old workplace disappeared into the rainy night. Jessica's apartment was on the third floor of an old building with no elevator. As she climbed the stairs, carrying her box of belongings, she found Mrs. Thompson waiting at her door. The former orphanage caretaker had kept in regular contact with Jessica, almost like a guardian angel. "Tom called me," Mrs. Thompson explained as Jessica unlocked the door. "I thought you might need a friend tonight." Inside the small apartment, Mrs. Thompson prepared tea while Jessica changed out of her wet clothes. The modest but cozy space contained only the essentials: a small open kitchen, a pull-out sofa, some photographs on the walls, and a bookshelf filled with books, most of them gifts from Mrs. Thompson over the years. "You know," Mrs. Thompson began, serving the tea in chipped mugs, "this reminds me of something that happened many years ago, when I was just starting at the orphanage." Jessica settled into the sofa, wrapped in an old blanket, bracing herself for one of those stories that always seemed to contain exactly the wisdom she needed at the moment. "There was a girl," Mrs. Thompson continued, "who came to the orphanage after losing everything in a fire. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, but still, when she saw other children shivering, she would share her only blanket. Many thought she was foolish to give away what little she had, but that girl knew something that most people take a lifetime to learn. Sometimes our greatest wealth lies in what we choose to give to others." Jessica smiled, recognizing the unspoken message. "And what happened to her?" "Today, she's the director of one of the largest charitable organizations in the state," Mrs. Thompson replied with a smile. "But the most important thing isn't where she ended up, it's how her kindness inspired others to be better." The conversation was interrupted by a particularly loud thunderclap, followed by the intensifying sound of rain. Jessica stood up to close the window and noticed a luxurious car pulling up in front of the building. Something unusual for this modest neighborhood. What worries me now is how I'm going to pay the rent, Jessica confessed as she sat back down. I had just managed to catch up on the bills and now? One thing at a time, advised Mrs. Thompson. Tomorrow we can look for some job opportunities. I have a few contacts who might be able to help. Jessica's phone rang, interrupting the conversation. It was an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, she answered. Miss Jessica? A professional, polite male voice came through the line. This is David Mitchell, assistant to Mr. Anderson, the owner of the gas station chain. Mr. Anderson would like to meet with you tomorrow morning, if possible. Jessica felt her heart race. A meeting? But I just got fired. Yes, we're aware of the incident, David responded. In fact, that's exactly why Mr. Anderson wants to speak with you. He was quite interested in your story. After confirming the time and address for the meeting, Jessica hung up the phone with trembling hands. Mrs. Thompson watched her with an enigmatic smile. See, the older woman said, pouring more tea. The universe has a funny way of responding to kindness. That night, after Mrs. Thompson left, Jessica stayed up for hours watching the rain through the window. Her thoughts alternated between worry about the future and curiosity about the mysterious meeting the next day. What could Mr. Anderson want with her? Would it be some kind of formal reprimand? Or was there something else at play? The note from Mr. Parker was still in her bag, slightly crumpled. Jessica read it over several times, thinking about his wife in the hospital, hoping they were both okay. Even though her act of kindness had cost her job, she felt a deep certainty in her heart that she had made the right choice. As she prepared to sleep, Jessica had no idea that her small act of compassion had set off a series of events that would transform not only her life, but the lives of many others. The next day held surprises she could never have anticipated, and the meeting with Mr. Anderson would be just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. The rain continued to fall throughout the night, washing the city streets and, symbolically, preparing the ground for a fresh start. Sometimes, Jessica thought before drifting off to sleep, you have to endure a storm to find your way to brighter days. The administrative headquarters building was both majestic and intimidating in the morning light. Jessica paused for a moment on the sidewalk, nervously adjusting the white blouse Mrs. Thompson had given her, her only truly professional outfit. Her hands trembled slightly as she double-checked the address on her phone, even though she already knew she was in the right place. The reflection in the mirrored glass entrance revealed a young woman trying to look more confident than she actually felt. Jessica had woken up 2 hours earlier to tame her unruly hair and apply light makeup, hoping to conceal the dark circles from a restless night. 15 minutes before the scheduled time, she took a deep breath and pushed through the revolving door. The reception area was elegant but not ostentatious. Soft music played in the background, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. An impeccably dressed receptionist greeted her with a professional smile that gave no hint as to whether she knew about the incident the day before. Miss Jessica? Mr. Anderson is expecting you. Please follow me. As they walked through the silent corridors, the sound of Jessica's low heels echoed against the marble floor. She observed the photographs lining the walls, images that told the story of the gas station chain from a single fuel pump to the empire it had become. In one of the oldest photos, a young, smiling man stood next to his first gas station. His eyes sparkled with the same determination Jessica recognized in herself. The meeting room, however, took her by surprise. It was smaller and cozier than she had imagined, featuring a dark wooden oval table and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Mr. Anderson stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, observing the bustling streets below. Beside him, to Jessica's complete shock, stood Mr. William Parker. Jessica. Mr. Anderson's voice was surprisingly warm. Please have a seat. We have a lot to discuss. He was nothing like the business tycoon Jessica had imagined. A man of average height, with neatly trimmed gray hair and sharp eyes behind reading glasses, he carried himself with a relaxed demeanor. Yet, there was something about his presence that commanded natural respect. You know, Jessica, he began, flipping through a folder, I spent last night reviewing some rather interesting numbers. In just 6 months since you started working with us, the station has seen a 47% increase in positive customer reviews. Convenience store sales are up by 23%, and most impressive of all, we've experienced a 35% growth in the number of returning customers. He paused, removing his glasses and looking at her directly. But what really intrigues me isn't those numbers. It's what happened yesterday. Jessica felt her heart race. Mr. Parker cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Jessica, yesterday I didn't have the chance to explain. Helen, my wife, has been battling an aggressive cancer for 8 months. Yesterday was a critical day. She had an experimental chemotherapy session that couldn't be rescheduled. I had spent our last bit of money on her medications. He had to pause, visibly overcome with emotion. Mr. Anderson placed a comforting hand on his shoulder before continuing. William and I have known each other for over 40 years. We started out together, two young dreamers trying to make a difference. He built a successful company, but the cost of Helen's treatments has drained their family's savings. Even so, out of pride, he refused to accept my help. Jessica listened in silence, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. Mr. Parker spoke again, his voice steadier now. When you filled my tank yesterday, it wasn't just gas you were giving me. It was hope. It was dignity. You didn't make me feel like a beggar. You treated me like a human being who needed help. And then? His voice faltered again. Then I saw you lose your job because of me. It wasn't your fault, Jessica interjected quickly. I'd do it all over again. Why? Mr. Anderson asked, leaning forward. Why risk your job and spend your own money for a complete stranger? The question hung in the air for a moment. Jessica thought about her own story, the lonely nights at the orphanage, the constant fear in her stepfather's house, and the kindness of Mrs. Thompson that had changed her life. When she answered, her voice was soft but resolute. Because I've been on the other side. I've needed help and had no one to turn to. I've felt the humiliation of not having enough, of having to choose between eating or taking the bus. When I saw Mr. Parker yesterday, I didn't just see a customer. I saw someone who needed help just like I once did. A profound silence followed her words. Mr. Anderson exchanged a meaningful glance with William before standing and walking to the window. Robert was fired this morning, he announced, still looking out. His actions not only go against everything I've built this company on, but they embody exactly the kind of mindset I need to eliminate. He turned to Jessica, his eyes gleaming with determination. We're launching a managerial training program. I want you to be our first candidate. The program includes a fully funded business degree, along with an initial salary 3 times your current one. Before Jessica could process what she had just heard, Mr. Parker stood up and pulled an envelope from his jacket. There's more, he said. Helen and I have decided to create an assistance fund for employees and customers facing emergencies. We want you to be the administrator. Your life experience, your compassion. You're the perfect person to identify who truly needs help and how to assist in the right way. Jessica felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Tears streamed freely down her face now, but she no longer cared to hide them. I don't know what to say, her voice trembled. Say you'll accept, Mr. Anderson smiled. Say you'll help us turn this company into something greater than just numbers on a spreadsheet. We need people like you, Jessica. People who understand that business can be about both profit and compassion. At that moment, Jessica thought of Mrs. Thompson and her advice to always keep kindness in her heart. She thought of all the people who had helped her along her journey and how she now had the chance to do the same for others. Yes, she replied, her voice steadier. I accept. What happened next took Jessica completely by surprise. Mr. Anderson picked up another envelope from the table. Great, he said with an even bigger smile. Because there's one more thing. William told me you used your transportation money to help him. So, he slid the envelope across the table. Consider this in advance on your new salary. And the keys? They're for the company car, which is now at your disposal. Jessica stared in disbelief at the envelope and the keys. This was more than just a second chance. It was an opportunity to turn her own story of pain into something positive, something that could help others who were going through what she once did. Fate had bigger plans for Jessica than she had ever imagined, and that meeting was only the beginning. Sometimes, a single act of kindness can set off a chain reaction of transformation, not just in one life but in an entire community. And as the morning sun continued to rise in the sky, flooding the room with light through the enormous windows, Jessica knew her life would never be the same again. The universe had conspired to turn her darkest moment into her greatest opportunity, proving that sometimes when we lose everything, it's simply to make room for something far greater. News of Jessica's life transformation spread quickly. When she returned to the gas station that afternoon, no longer as an attendant but as a trainee manager, the atmosphere was completely different. The employees who had once worked under Robert's oppressive command now looked at her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Tom, the convenience store clerk who had been her ally the day before, was the first to greet her. You deserve this, Jessica. Everyone here knows that. But not everyone was happy about the change. Alice, one of the senior employees who had always been close to Robert, cast distrustful glances in Jessica's direction. During the first team meeting Jessica led, Alice didn't hesitate to voice her dissatisfaction. "So now we're just handing out money to anyone with a sob story?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Is that how we're going to run a business?" Jessica felt all eyes in the room turn to her. It was her first real test as a leader. Taking a deep breath, she remembered Mrs. Thompson's words about turning tough experiences into wisdom. "No, Alice," she replied calmly. "We're going to create a fair and transparent system to help those who truly need it while keeping our business strong. And do you know why? Because I've been on the other side of that counter, needing help and having no one to turn to." Jessica then shared her story with the team for the first time, the difficult years with her stepfather, her life in the orphanage, and her daily struggles to survive. When she finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Even Alice seemed affected. "But I'm not here to dwell on the past," Jessica continued. "I'm here to build a different future, not just for myself but for all of us. Mr. Anderson isn't just giving me a chance. He's giving us the opportunity to prove that we can succeed while staying true to our humanity." In the days that followed, Jessica threw herself wholeheartedly into her new responsibilities. During the day, she coordinated the gas station team, gradually implementing subtle yet meaningful changes. At night, she dedicated herself to studying the managerial training program, often falling asleep over her books on business administration and accounting. A week after stepping into her new role, Jessica received an unexpected phone call from the hospital. Helen Parker, William's wife, was requesting to see her. With her heart heavy, fearing bad news, Jessica drove there immediately. The hospital room where Helen was staying was bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. William sat by the bed, holding his wife's hand. Helen was a petite woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to defy the frailty of her body. "So, you're the angel who saved my stubborn husband," Helen said, her voice weak but warm. "He told me everything about that day. You know, if he'd missed that chemotherapy session?" She paused, squeezing her husband's hand. "The doctors say the results are promising. And I owe that to you." Jessica tried to protest, but Helen gently interrupted. "It's not just about the gas, dear. It's about what your gesture represented. You see, William and I built everything we have because of the kindness of strangers. When we were young and just starting out, people believed in us and gave us chances. But somewhere along the way we forgot how important it is to give back." Helen's words struck a deep chord with Jessica, who opened up and shared more of her own story. By the end of the visit, a special bond had formed between the three of them in that hospital room. Back at the gas station, Jessica began to notice subtle shifts in the team's attitude. Alice, who had initially been her harshest critic, approached her after her shift. "I'm sorry for what I said that day," Alice began, clearly uncomfortable. "It's just, I've worked here for 15 years. I've seen a lot of people come and go, always with big promises of change. Robert, at least, was predictable in his harshness." Jessica listened attentively as Alice continued, "But you're different. Today, a woman came in with a broken-down car, no money to fix it. Instead of sending her away, you not only arranged the repair but also found her a ride. I saw how the team jumped in to help. That never happened before." The sun had already set by the time Alice finished her confession. Jessica smiled, recalling her own transformations. "Sometimes," she said, "we just need a chance to show the best of ourselves." That night, after her shift, Jessica met Mrs. Thompson for coffee. The small cafe where they gathered was simple but welcoming, much like the memories they shared. "You won't believe it," Jessica began, her eyes shining with excitement. "Remember that project I mentioned about creating an emergency aid system? Today we helped 3 people. One of them was a single mom who needed to take her son to the doctor but had no gas." Mrs. Thompson smiled, that wise smile she always reserved for special moments. "See? Life has a funny way of closing circles. Have you realized you're doing exactly what others did for you in the past?" Jessica paused, the coffee cup halfway to her mouth, absorbing the depth of that observation. It was true. Every small act of kindness she could now offer felt like an echo of the people who had helped her during her hardest times. "But there's more," Jessica continued, setting her cup down on the table. "Mr. Anderson approved a pilot project to implement the aid program across all the stations in the network. He wants me to lead the training for the teams. And how do you feel about that?" Mrs. Thompson asked, observing her former protégé closely. "Scared," Jessica admitted with a small nervous laugh. "But also, fulfilled. As if everything I've been through has a bigger purpose that I'm just beginning to understand." The bell above the cafe door rang, and Jessica saw Tom entering with a few other employees from the station. They waved, smiling, and Jessica realized how much the work environment had changed in such a short time. "Do you know what's even more amazing?" she continued, turning back to Mrs. Thompson. "People are starting to genuinely care about each other. Today, when that woman needed help with her car, I didn't have to ask anyone for help. The team just jumped in naturally." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "That's how kindness works, Jessica. It's contagious. When one person starts, others follow the example. It's like a chain reaction." As Jessica drove home that night, she reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just 1 week. The small apartment that once felt like a symbol of her limitations now served as a reminder of where she had started and how much she had accomplished. On her desk, the books from her business course waited for her, alongside the plans for the 8 program she was developing. There was still a lot of work ahead, but for the first time in her life, Jessica felt she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was born to do. The phone rang. It was William Parker with exciting news about Helen's treatment. As they spoke, Jessica realized that she had gained more than just a new job or an opportunity for growth. She had gained a new family, a new mission, a new chance to make a difference in the world. And that, she thought as she prepared for another night of studying, was worth more than all the money in the world. 3 months had passed since Jessica took on her new role. The 8 program had grown beyond the initial expectations, and her story of overcoming adversity was beginning to inspire change throughout the network of stations. However, on what seemed like an ordinary morning, an unexpected event would shake her newly established stability. Jessica was in her office reviewing reports when Alice burst through the door without knocking. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling as she held a local newspaper. "Jessica, you need to see this," Alice said, extending the paper. On the front page, a bold headline made Jessica's heart stop. "Former manager accuses gas station chain of fraud and social program." The article, signed by Robert, her former boss, claimed that the 8 program was a cover for money laundering. "This is ridiculous," Jessica exclaimed, but her hands shook as she read the rest of the article. Robert had given a detailed interview, twisting every aspect of the program and insinuating that she was involved in illegal activities. "Anonymous source reveals embezzlement scheme in gas station social program," the headline screamed in bold black letters. Jessica felt the blood draining from her face as she carefully read each word, meticulously crafted to destroy everything she had built over the past 3 months. Robert had done a thorough job. The article implied that the 8 program was an elaborate front for money laundering. It cited internal documents that supposedly proved the funds were not reaching the true recipients. But the lowest blow came in the last paragraph, where he questioned Jessica's past, suggesting that her orphanage story was fabricated to gain sympathy. "This is a nightmare," Jessica murmured, letting the newspaper fall onto the desk. Alice, who had become one of her most loyal supporters, appeared equally stunned. "Nobody's going to believe this," Alice said, but her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. The phone started ringing incessantly. Reporters wanted statements, clients demanded explanations, and the network's headquarters needed immediate answers. Jessica felt like she was suffocating under the weight of the accusations. "Jessica?" Tom's voice came from the door. There are some people outside. Reporters. And Robert's with them." Through her office window, Jessica could see the TV cameras and microphones. Robert was out there, dressed in a well-tailored suit, gesturing as he spoke to the reporters. His satisfied smile felt like a knife twisting in her stomach. "He planned this," Jessica said, more to herself than to anyone else. "He waited until the show was big enough to cause the maximum damage." Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mr. Anderson. "Don't talk to the press. I'm on my way." But the real blow was still to come. Minutes later, her phone rang again. It was Helen Parker, her usually calm voice now trembling with worry. "Jessica, darling, I just saw the news. But there's something worse. William had a heart attack when he saw the paper this morning. He's in the ICU." The world seemed to slow down. William Parker, the man who had become like a father to her, was fighting for his life because of this lie. Helen, still recovering from her own treatment, was now facing this new trial. "I need to go there," Jessica said, but Helen interrupted her. "No, darling. Now you need to fight. William always said you have the same strength he saw in me when we were young. Prove he's right." Helen's words sparked something inside Jessica. Memories of her difficult childhood, the nights at the orphanage, the moments of despair, all of it had prepared her for this moment. "Alice," she called, her voice finding a new firmness. "I need all the records from the program. Every receipt, every story, every person we've helped." "I'm on it," Alice replied, moving quickly. Tom, gather all the staff for an emergency meeting. Now. As the team gathered in the conference room, Jessica thought about Mrs. Thompson and her lessons on turning pain into strength. She was no longer the frightened girl hiding from her stepfather. She was a woman who had learned to turn her own story of pain into hope for others. The room was packed when she began to speak. You all know my story. You know our work. You know the truth about what we do here. I need to know right now who's with me in this fight. One by one the staff stood up. Even those who had initially resisted the changes were now by her side. Silent tears ran down Alice's face as she organized piles of documents. I've got something, Tom said, rushing into the room with his cell phone. I recorded Robert last week when he came here at night. He was drunk, threatening to get revenge, saying he was going to destroy everything. Jessica took the phone and listened to the recording. Robert's drunken voice revealed not only his bitterness but also admitted that his accusations were false. At that moment, Mr. Anderson arrived, accompanied by his legal team. His face was serious, but his eyes shone with determination. I just spoke with William at the hospital, he said. He's stable. And I brought something you all need to see. He opened his briefcase, revealing a series of documents. Robert wasn't just fired for his behavior. We discovered that he had been embezzling money for years. Small amounts well hidden. When we implemented the assistance program and increased transparency in the accounts, he realized he was about to be caught. The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Suddenly, everything made sense. The resistance Robert had to the changes, his bitterness, his thirst for revenge. But it's not enough just to prove he's guilty, Jessica said, standing up. We need to show that what we've built here is real. In the hours that followed, an extraordinary mobilization began. Clients who had been helped by the program started showing up at the station spontaneously, eager to share their stories. A woman brought her son, now recovered from an emergency surgery that had only been possible thanks to the program. An elderly man showed pictures of his wife, who had been able to complete her cancer treatment with the help they had received. The media, which just hours before had been hungry for a scandal, now faced a different story. Dozens of ordinary people sharing real-life accounts of how a simple gas station had changed their lives. Mrs. Thompson arrived in the afternoon, bringing records from the orphanage that proved Jessica's story. Some truths, she said with her trademark wisdom, are too strong to be buried by lies. By evening, when the dust began to settle, Jessica finally had a moment to process it all. Sitting in her office, looking out the window, she saw something that made her heart tighten. A line of cars was forming at the station. Ordinary people, some she didn't even know, had organized a rally of support. Her phone rang. It was Helen again. William woke up, she said, her voice now lighter. The first thing he asked was if you were okay. He told me to tell you he's proud of you. We both are. Jessica let the tears flow freely as she watched the scene outside. From an attempt at destruction had been born something even stronger. A united community, people determined to protect something they believed was precious. The crisis wasn't over. There would still be legal battles ahead, statements to make and truths to defend. But that night, looking at the lights of the cars and the people gathered in support, Jessica understood something fundamental. Sometimes it takes someone trying to tear us down to realize how many people are ready to lift us up. And as the first stars began to appear in the sky, she knew that this would just be another story of overcoming adversity in her life. Not the last, but certainly one of the most important. The following morning brought a twist no one could have predicted. Jessica had just arrived at the station when her phone rang. It was Rachel, one of the receptionists at the administrative office. Jessica, you need to come here immediately, Rachel's voice trembled. It's about Robert, he's here with, well, you need to see this in person. Intrigued and apprehensive, Jessica drove to the office. In the parking lot, she noticed a police car and her heart skipped a beat. When she entered the building, the scene she encountered left her frozen. Robert was handcuffed, surrounded by officers, while a woman in tears shouted at him. How could you? It was the money for her treatment. Our own daughter. The woman was Susan, Robert's wife, whom Jessica only knew by sight. By her side was Mr. Anderson, wearing a grave expression she had never seen before. Jessica, I'm glad you're here, Mr. Anderson said. I think you need to hear this. The scene in the administrative lobby was surreal. Robert, the man who had stood in front of cameras just 24 hours earlier, launching accusations against Jessica and the aid program, was now handcuffed, his face not marked by the arrogance of the day before, but by a deathly pallor. He stole everything. Susan screamed, her face streaked with tears and sleepless nights. The money for Emily's treatment, our savings, everything. Emily, Jessica knew that name. She was Robert's 16-year-old daughter, suffering from a severe heart condition. The few times Robert had shown any humanity at work were when he spoke of his daughter and her fight for life. Mr. Anderson led everyone to a more private conference room. The officers remained with Robert while Susan, still trembling, sat beside Jessica. "You need to understand the gravity of what we've uncovered," Mr. Anderson began, his voice heavy. Robert wasn't just embezzling money from the company. He was stealing from his own daughter's treatment fund. Susan wiped away her tears and began speaking, her voice broken by sobs. "Emily needs urgent heart surgery. We spent years saving, holding raffles, asking friends and family for help. We finally had the amount we needed." She paused, struggling to continue. "Last night, I went to the bank to make the initial payment for the hospital. The account was empty." Jessica's stomach churned. Mr. Anderson continued the explanation. "When we started investigating Robert's accusations against the aid program, we discovered a pattern of suspicious transactions. He had been embezzling small amounts for years, but recently, the sums had increased significantly." "His gambling addiction," murmured Susan, her face a mask of pain. "I didn't know, he hid it so well. He said he was working overtime, that he was getting higher commissions." Robert, still handcuffed, kept his eyes fixed on the floor. His silence was deafening. "Last night," Mr. Anderson continued, "after the story broke in the media, Robert tried to make one last big bet, thinking he could recover everything he had lost. He used the money for Emily's surgery." Jessica watched the scene, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to feel satisfaction at the fall of the man who had tried to destroy her, but all she could feel was a profound sadness, not just for Robert but mainly for Emily, the innocent teenager who now saw her chance at life slipping through her fingers. It was then that something clicked in her mind. "The relief fund," she said suddenly, making everyone turn toward her. "Mr. Anderson, how much do we have available in the fund?" Mr. Anderson grabbed his tablet, quickly checking the numbers. "After all the publicity yesterday, we've received a significant amount of donations. People wanting to show their support for the program? We can help Emily," Jessica declared, her voice firm. "That's exactly what the fund is for, to help those who truly need it." Robert finally lifted his eyes, meeting Jessica's gaze for the first time. What she saw there was no longer the arrogant man who had fired her, nor the vengeful accuser of the media, but someone completely shattered by the weight of their own actions. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you help my daughter after everything I've done?" Jessica thought of her own story, the people who had helped her when she needed it most. Mrs. Thompson, the Parkers, Mr. Anderson. "Because," she replied, "your daughter shouldn't pay for your mistakes. And sometimes, the greatest revenge is showing kindness to those who try to destroy us." Susan covered her face with her hands, sobbing even harder. Mr. Anderson was already on the phone, starting the procedures to release the emergency aid for Emily. At that moment, Jessica received a message on her phone. It was a picture of William Parker, still in the hospital but now sitting on the bed, smiling next to Helen. The message read, "We heard the news. You continue to surprise us with your ability to turn darkness into light." Things moved quickly after that morning. Robert was taken by the police to answer for his crimes. The hospital agreed to perform Emily's surgery as soon as the funds were released. The media, which the day before had been hungry for scandal, now had a completely different story to tell. But for Jessica, the most significant moment came 3 weeks later, when she visited Emily in the hospital after her successful surgery. The teenager was recovering well, her new heart beating strong in her chest. "My dad said it was you who saved my life," Emily said, her voice still weak but her eyes shining. "Even after everything he did." Jessica held the girl's hand, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "Sometimes," she replied, "life gives us the chance to break cycles of pain. Your dad made mistakes, but you have your whole life ahead of you to write your own story." That night, driving back home, Jessica reflected on how life had surprising ways of closing circles. The aid program, which Robert had tried to destroy with his lies, had ended up saving his own daughter's life. It was an irony that carried a deep lesson about the transformative power of kindness. Her phone rang. It was Mrs. Thompson, inviting her for a coffee. Jessica smiled, thinking about how much she needed that conversation, that wisdom that had always guided her through the toughest moments. Some stories need to be shared in order to be fully understood, and this was definitely one of them. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, as Jessica drove toward the cafe where Mrs. Thompson was waiting for her. Somehow, she knew this wasn't the end of her story. but only the beginning of a new chapter. One where every challenge overcome became an opportunity to make a difference in someone's life. A year had passed since that turbulent morning at the administrative headquarters. The aid program, far from being destroyed by Robert's defamation attempt, had expanded to the entire network of stations and inspired other companies to create similar initiatives. Jessica, now graduated in her business administration course and promoted to Director of Social Responsibility for the network, was in her office reviewing some documents when she received an unexpected letter. The sender was from the state penitentiary. It was a spring afternoon when Jessica, sitting in her new office at the administrative headquarters, received a letter that made her heart stop for a moment. The simple envelope had the state penitentiary's seal, and the sender was Robert. For a few minutes, she just held the envelope, memories of the previous year flashing through her mind like a movie. So much had changed since then. The aid program now operated at all 50 locations in the network, having helped over 1,000 families. Other companies had started implementing similar programs, creating a network of solidarity that was spreading across the city. With slightly trembling hands, Jessica opened the letter. "Dear Jessica, I've spent months trying to find the right words for this letter. How do you ask for forgiveness from someone who not only survived my attempt to destroy them but turned my own malice into something good? Emily visits me every week. Her heart, the heart you helped save, beats strong and healthy. She tells me about her plans to go to medical school, inspired by the second chance she received. Susan found a new job and is rebuilding her life. From my cell, I have plenty of time to think. I remember the day I fired you for helping that elderly man, William Parker, as I came to know him later. At the time, I was so consumed by bitterness that I couldn't see the beauty in what you did. Yesterday, Emily told me she's volunteering at the hospital. She said she learned from you that sometimes our greatest pain can become our greatest strength to help others. My daughter, who I nearly killed with my greed, now spends her weekends helping others. I don't expect your forgiveness, Jessica. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that your kindness not only saved my daughter. She is changing generations. With regret and gratitude, Robert." Jessica left the letter on the desk, feeling the tears run freely down her face. In that moment, Mrs. Thompson entered her office. Now 70 years old, she worked as a volunteer counselor for the aid program. "Tough news?" asked the woman, noticing Jessica's tears. "No," Jessica replied, passing the letter to Mrs. Thompson. "Just more proof that kindness has a power we can't even imagine." As Mrs. Thompson read the letter, Jessica stood up and walked to the window. Down below, at the gas station attached to the headquarters, she could see Alice, now the manager, helping a young mother with a stroller. The aid program had become a natural part of the routine, as integrated into the station's operations as the fuel itself. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said, finishing the letter, "when you arrived at the orphanage that day, so hurt and frightened, I prayed every night that you would find your way. I never imagined that not only would you find your way, but you'd pave roads for so many others." The phone rang. It was Helen Parker. William had been given a clean bill of health by his cardiologist and wanted to celebrate with a special dinner. His complete recovery was yet another miracle in the chain of events that had begun with a simple act of kindness. "You're coming to the dinner, right?" asked Helen. "After all, you're practically our daughter now." Jessica smiled, agreeing. The Parkers had become the family she'd never had. William, recovered from the heart attack, was now a member of the advisory board for the aid program, bringing his business expertise to help expand the initiative. After hanging up the phone, Jessica found Mrs. Thompson still watching her with that maternal, proud gaze that always warmed her heart. "I'm visiting the orphanage tomorrow," Jessica said. "The kids are excited about the new mentorship program we're starting." The program was her latest initiative, connecting children from the orphanage with successful professionals who also came from humble beginnings. It was her way of multiplying the opportunities she had received. "You've turned your pain into purpose," Mrs. Thompson observed. "There's no greater gift than that." That evening, during dinner at the Parkers' home, Jessica looked around the table. There were William and Helen, who had become her heart parents, Mrs. Thompson, her eternal mentor, Alice and Tom, who had gone from colleagues to loyal friends, and Emily, Robert's daughter, who had become an extraordinary young woman. Mr. Anderson raised his glass for a toast. "To Jessica, who taught us that sometimes the greatest act of strength is choosing kindness when it would be easier to choose revenge." Jessica felt her heart overflowing with gratitude. Her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined on that rainy afternoon when she decided to help a stranger in need. The aid program continued to grow. Other companies in the city began creating similar initiatives. A network of solidarity was spreading, proving that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to take the first step, to show that it is possible to do things differently. Later that night in her apartment, Jessica found an old photo. She was 8 years old, freshly arrived at the orphanage, her eyes still marked by fear. Beside that photo she placed a more recent one, her surrounded by her new family, her eyes now shining with purpose and joy. Life had taught her that the greatest victories don't always come from defeating our enemies, but from transforming them through the power of love and compassion. Robert in his cell was learning this lesson. Emily with her new heart was living this truth. And Jessica, the girl who once had nothing but pain, now had everything, not in material possessions, but in purpose and human connections. Her story wasn't just about overcoming adversity or achieving success. It was about how a single act of kindness can trigger a chain reaction of transformation, touching lives in ways we could never predict. And so, in a city that learned day by day the value of compassion, Jessica continued her journey, proving that sometimes our greatest wounds can become our greatest gifts to the world. So, what do you think of this story of overcoming obstacles? How would you have reacted in Jessica's shoes? Do you believe that kindness really has the power to transform lives like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched your heart and you want more inspiring content like this, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new story of triumph and transformation. With your support, we can keep bringing stories that inspire and move. See you in the next story. Big hug.